What happens when a man with a little power tries to destroy the future of a woman with unseen connections? In the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of JFK International Airport, a single act of malice is about to ignite a firestorm. This isn't just a story about a torn piece of paper. It's a story about the clash between petty tyranny and quiet strength, between a dream almost shattered and a reckoning that will echo from the TSA checkpoint all the way to the highest office in the nation's aviation authority. Prepare yourself for a story of injustice, a shocking twist of fate, and the kind of real-life karma that is both devastating and deeply satisfying. The air in John F. Kennedy International Airport's Terminal 4 was a familiar cocktail of floor cleaner jet fuel and human anxiety. But for Amara Vance, it smelled like victory. Clutched in her hand was a passport, and nestled within its pages was the crisp, embossed F1 student visa that represented the culmination of her entire life's work. At 21 years old, she was on her way to the University of Oxford, the recipient of the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship. Her field was post-colonial literature, and the irony of her current predicament standing in a serpentine queue waiting for the approval of a uniformed American agent before she could depart for the old colonial heartland was not lost on her. She was the pride of her family, the brilliant daughter who had outshone every expectation. Her father, a history professor, and her mother, a surgeon, had instilled in her a quiet confidence and a ferocious intellect. They had celebrated her achievement with a small, tearful party just last night. Now, all that stood between her and the dreaming spires of Oxford was this final gauntlet, the Transportation Security Administration. The line shuffled forward with agonizing slowness. Finally, it was her turn. She stepped up to the podium, placing her carry-on bag on the belt and her laptop in a separate bin. The agent beckoning her forward was a man whose posture seemed to have been molded by years of resentment. His name tag read R. Peterson. Robert Rob Peterson was a man in his late 40s with a soft paunch straining against the buttons of his blue uniform, and a face that seemed permanently soured as if he'd just bitten into a lemon. His eyes, small and watery, scanned Amara not as a person, but as a collection of potential threats. He had once dreamed of being a pilot, of soaring above the clouds, but a minor astigmatism and 2 failed flight school exams had grounded him permanently. Now his kingdom was this 6-foot stretch of linoleum, his scepter a handheld metal detector, and his power was absolute, albeit temporary. He derived a grim satisfaction from the flicker of fear in the eyes of travelers, the brief moment where their multi-million-dollar business deals, their life-changing vacations, their entire futures depended on his mood. Passport, he grunted, not making eye contact. Amara slid the dark blue booklet across the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and steady. Peterson grunted again, flipping open the passport with a practiced, dismissive flick of his thumb. He scanned the photo page, then looked up at her, his eyes narrowing. He held the passport up, comparing the poised, smiling young woman in the photo to the one standing before him. "Where you headed?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "London. I'm a student at Oxford." A small, irrepressible spark of pride lit her voice. It was a mistake. Peterson's lip curled into a faint sneer. "Oxford, huh, fancy." He flipped through the pages slowly, deliberately, as if searching for a flaw. He stopped at the visa. He stared at it for a long, uncomfortable moment. This visa was issued in Washington, D.C. "Yes, I had my interview at the embassy there," Amara confirmed. "What for? My scholarship program required it. What scholarship? He pressed his gaze, hardening. He was no longer just processing a passenger. He was conducting an interrogation. The Rhodes Scholarship, she said, keeping her voice even, refusing to be intimidated. A flicker of something disbelief, or perhaps envy, crossed Peterson's face. He looked from the pristine visa back to Amara's calm, intelligent face. She was young, black, and poised for a future he could only dream of. In his cramped and bitter worldview, it didn't add up. It felt like a personal affront. People like her in his mind shouldn't get breaks like that. His own son was struggling to pay for community college. Rhodes Scholar, he repeated, drawing the words out with mocking slowness. He tapped a thick finger on the visa. Looks a little new. Too crisp. You know, we see a lot of fakes. High-quality forgeries coming out of all sorts of places. Amara's blood ran cold. I can assure you it is not a fake. It was issued by the U.S. Embassy. You can verify its authenticity. She gestured to the biometric chip symbol on her passport. All my information is in the system. The system, Peterson scoffed, a humorless laugh rattling in his chest. The system can be fooled. He held the passport up to the light, angling it this way and that. The people behind Amara were beginning to shift impatiently, but Peterson was in his element. He was the director of this small, ugly play, and he would not be rushed. "What is your father's name?" he demanded suddenly. The question was so out of left field it momentarily stunned her. I don't see how that's relevant. I'll decide what's relevant, miss. He snapped, his voice rising. Answer the question. Dr. Alistair Vance. And what does Dr. Vance do for a living? The emphasis on her father's title was pure acid. He's a professor of history at Howard University. And your mother? She's a cardiothoracic surgeon at Johns Hopkins. Each answer, each prestigious institution she named, seemed to fuel Peterson's animosity. It was the casual, unboastful recitation of a life of privilege and achievement that he could never touch. It was everything he resented. He felt the familiar hot surge of indignation. This girl with her perfect life and her fancy scholarship standing there looking at him like he was the inconvenience. He closed the passport. I'm not satisfied, he said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. The document feels off. The story feels rehearsed. Amara's heart was now hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and rising anger. What are you talking about? You can scan it. You can call the embassy. There are a dozen ways to verify my identity and my documents in under 60 seconds. I don't need a computer to tell me when something isn't right, Peterson said, leaning forward. His breath smelled of stale coffee. My gut tells me this is fraudulent. He was holding her future in his hand. The visa wasn't just a travel document. It was the key that unlocked everything. It was the years of late-night study sessions, the sacrifices her parents had made, the dreams she had nurtured since she was a little girl, reading novels in her room. Agent Peterson. Amara, said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with steel. You are making a serious mistake. Oh, I'm making a mistake, he chuckled, a truly unpleasant sound. He enjoyed her fear. He enjoyed the power he held over her. He opened the passport again to the visa page, holding it so she had a clear view. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to stretch for an eternity, he hooked his thumb and forefinger over the top edge of the visa. Amara's eyes widened in horror. No, she whispered. Don't. The sound of tearing paper was shockingly loud in the relative quiet of the checkpoint. It was a sharp, violent rip. Rip! He tore it cleanly from the top edge, down to the middle, splitting the embossed seal and her photograph in two. He didn't stop there. He tore the other half, separating the visa completely from the passport page it had been affixed to. The two pieces of her future fluttered onto the cold, stainless steel counter. Silence. The hum of the conveyor belt, the distant announcements, all of it faded away. Amara stared at the ruined document. Her breath hitched in her chest. It was an act of such profound, senseless malice that her mind struggled to comprehend it. Peterson looked at her, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. "Document is invalid," he declared, his voice booming with authority. "Appears to be a forgery that couldn't even hold up to a simple handling test. You're denied entry to the secure area. Step aside." For a moment, Amara couldn't move. She was paralyzed by a tidal wave of emotions, shock, rage, and a grief so sharp it felt like a physical blow. Her flight was in 2 hours. Her academic year, her scholarship, her entire plan, all of it was vaporizing before her eyes. You can't do that," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I just did," Peterson said, gesturing with his thumb. "Step aside, now, or I'll have you removed for causing a disturbance." The people behind her were now openly staring, their impatience mixed with a horrified curiosity. No one intervened. They were all cogs in the same machine, afraid that a single word would draw the gatekeeper's wrath upon them. Amara finally found her voice, and when it came, it was not the whisper of a victim, but the low, shaking tone of someone who had been pushed past their breaking point. "You have no idea what you've just done," she said, her eyes locking onto his. Peterson laughed. "I know exactly what I did. I did my job. Now get out of my line." Amara slowly reached into her purse, her hands shaking with adrenaline. She didn't reach for a tissue. She reached for her phone. Peterson watched her amused. "Who you gonna call your fancy professor, Daddy?" Amara didn't answer. She found the number in her contacts, a number she had been told to use only in the gravest of emergencies. She pressed the call button. As it began to ring, she held Peterson's gaze, her own eyes burning with a cold fire he had fatally underestimated. The call connected. "Uncle Marcus," she said, her voice miraculously steady. "I have a problem." The name Uncle Marcus hung in the air between them, meaningless to Robert Peterson. It was to him just another pathetic attempt by a caught fraudster to save face. He pictured some local lawyer or a small-town councilman. He folded his arms across his chest, the picture of unmovable authority, and waited for the performance to end. Amara turned slightly, shielding the phone with her body to give herself a sliver of privacy. "I'm at JFK Terminal 4. The TSA checkpoint," she said into the phone, her voice low and precise. She recounted the events with a clarity that belied the emotional storm raging within her. She didn't cry or shout. She reported the facts, the agent's name, his accusations, and the physical destruction of her government-issued visa. On the other end of the line, Marcus Thorne listened without interruption. He was not in some small-town council office. He was in his spacious, soundproofed office in Washington, D.C., a bank of monitors displaying flight patterns and national weather systems glowing behind him. Marcus Thorne was the sitting United States Undersecretary for Aviation Security, a powerful and widely respected figure who reported directly to the Secretary of Homeland Security. The entire Transportation Security Administration fell under his vast purview. An uncle by deep family friendship rather than blood, he had known Amara since she was born and loved her like his own daughter. As he listened, his friendly public-facing demeanor evaporated, replaced by a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had spent 2 decades building systems protocols and training programs to prevent exactly this kind of abuse of power. His agent had not just inconvenienced a traveler, he had assaulted the very legitimacy of the documents his organization was sworn to protect. And he had done it to one of the nation's brightest young minds, a girl Marcus personally vouched for. "Amara," he said, his voice a calm, reassuring baritone that cut through her panic. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not move from that spot. Do not engage with the agent further. Is his supervisor there? I don't know. He hasn't called anyone." "He will," Marcus said, a chilling certainty in his tone. "Put me on speakerphone, Amara. Hold the phone out so he can hear me." She did as she was told, her hand still trembling. "My uncle would like to speak to you," she said to Peterson. Peterson rolled his eyes dramatically. "Oh, for God's sake. Ma'am, I'm not interested in— This is Undersecretary Marcus Thorne." A powerful, resonant voice boomed from the phone's tiny speaker. "To whom am I speaking?" The use of the formal title delivered with such instantaneous command gave Peterson his first tiny prickle of doubt. Still, he clung to his arrogance. "This is Officer Peterson, and I don't know who you are, pal, but you can't— Officer Peterson." The voice cut him off, sharp as broken glass. "You will address me as Mr. Secretary. You have 2 seconds to find your direct supervisor and put him on this phone, or I will personally ensure that the next voice you hear is that of a federal marshal asking you to surrender your badge." The threat was so specific, so packed with bureaucratic violence that it finally shattered Peterson's smug composure. The color drained from his face. Federal marshal. Surrender your badge. This wasn't some local lawyer. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Yes, sir." "One moment, sir." He stammered, his entire demeanor changing in a humiliating instant. He turned his eyes, darting around wildly, and barked into his shoulder radio. "Chen, get to checkpoint Alpha 3. Now." While Peterson was scrambling, Marcus spoke to Amara, his voice softening again. "You did good, kiddo. Just hold on. This is going to be handled." A moment later, a harried-looking man in a slightly better-fitting uniform hustled over. This was David Chen, the checkpoint's shift supervisor. Chen was a man who lived by the primary rule of middle management: avoid trouble, de-escalate conflict, and keep the line moving. A scene like this was his worst nightmare. "What's going on, Rob?" he said, his eyes on the growing queue of annoyed passengers. "We've got a bottleneck." This passenger," Peterson stammered, gesturing at Amara. "She's got some guy on the phone claiming to be—" Amara held the phone out to Chen. "He wants to speak to you. He says his name is Marcus Thorne." Chen looked at the phone with suspicion, then at Peterson's pale, sweaty face. He took the phone. "This is Supervisor David Chen." "Who is this Mr. Chen?" The voice from the phone replied, colder and harder than before. "I am the Undersecretary for Aviation Security. I am looking at a live CCTV feed of your checkpoint time-stamped 3 minutes ago, which appears to show one of your officers an R. Peterson willfully destroying a valid US F1 visa belonging to a Ms. Amara Vance. Before I make a series of calls that will permanently alter the careers of every single person at that checkpoint, I suggest you explain to me precisely what is going on." David Chen froze. The phone in his hand suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Live CCTV feed. Undersecretary. This was not a drill. This was a Category 5 hurricane making landfall directly on his career. His mind raced, trying to find a path out, a way to contain the damage. His first instinct, honed by years of bureaucratic survival, was to minimize. "Sir, Mr. Secretary?" He began, his voice suddenly obsequious. "I can assure you there has been a misunderstanding." Officer Peterson had a reasonable suspicion about the document's authenticity. "It may have been damaged accidentally during inspection. It's a very chaotic environment here, sir." He was lying to protect his subordinate, to protect himself, hoping to placate the voice on the phone with procedural jargon. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. A misunderstanding. Marcus's voice was now laced with a dangerous calm. "Accidentally damaged, Mr. Chen. I have been in this business for 25 years. I know the difference between an accident and a deliberate act of vandalism. I also know that your officer accused a Rhodes Scholar of forgery without performing a single electronic verification check. Is that standard procedure at JFK now? Mr. Chen tearing up visas based on gut feelings." Chen was sweating profusely now. "No, sir. Of course not, sir." He shot a venomous glare at Peterson, who seemed to be shrinking inside his uniform. "Here is what is going to happen, Mr. Chen." Marcus continued his voice, leaving no room for negotiation. "You will immediately escort Ms. Vance with my profound apologies to your supervisory office. You will provide her with a comfortable chair, a bottle of water, and absolute quiet. You will then confiscate Officer Peterson's badge and SED credentials. He is suspended effective this second. You will ensure he does not leave the airport. The JFK Federal Security Director, Robert Ames, will be meeting him shortly, along with investigators from the Office of Professional Responsibility. Am I making myself clear?" "Yes, Mr. Secretary." "Perfectly." Chen's voice was a squeak. And Mr. Chen, Marcus added one final devastating blow. "Your own conduct and your attempt to misrepresent this incident to me have been duly noted. Expect a call from Director Ames as well." The line went dead. Chen slowly lowered the phone, his hand shaking. He looked at Amara, no longer seeing a troublesome passenger, but the epicenter of an explosion that was about to vaporize his career. He looked at the two torn pieces of her visa lying on the counter, like casualties of a tiny, brutal war. Then he looked at Rob Peterson, and his expression was one of pure, unadulterated loathing. "You absolute grade A moron," Chen hissed under his breath. He then composed his face into a mask of strained professionalism. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice dripping with a false, desperate politeness. "Please come with me. We are so terribly sorry for this inconvenience." As Chen led a still shaken but resolute Amara away from the checkpoint, Peterson stood frozen, the full weight of what he had done finally crashing down on him. The other TSA agents at nearby positions, who had watched the drama unfold, now pointedly avoided his gaze. He was no longer one of them. He was a pariah. The power he had wielded so cruelly just minutes before had vanished, leaving him utterly, terrifyingly exposed. His little kingdom had crumbled, and the call had only been the first tremor. The earthquake was still on its way. The supervisory office was a small, windowless room with gray fabric-covered walls and the stale smell of microwaved popcorn. It was a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of a university library or the vibrant energy of her family home, but at that moment, it was a sanctuary. David Chen, his face a ghastly shade of pale, gestured for Amara to sit in a worn office chair. He scurried to a small mini-fridge and produced a bottle of water, offering it to her with the trembling hands of a man offering a sacrifice to an angry god. "Ms. Vance." I cannot apologize enough," he stammered. "This is not who we are. Officer Peterson's actions were unacceptable, a complete aberration." Amara looked at him, her initial shock solidifying into a cold, clear-eyed assessment. "He accused me of being a criminal," she stated, her voice quiet but firm. "And you tried to tell my uncle it was an accident." Chen flinched as if struck. I was trying to de-escalate. He couldn't finish. There was no excuse. He knew it, and he knew that she knew it. The power dynamic had been inverted so completely, it was dizzying. Minutes ago, she was at his mercy. Now his entire professional life was at hers. As Chen fumbled for words, Amara's phone buzzed. It was a text from her uncle. "An airline representative is on their way to you now to handle your flight. Director Ames is on site. Do not leave that room. I'm on the first flight out of DCA. I'll see you in a few hours." He was coming. The cavalry wasn't just on the phone. It was on its way. A wave of relief so profound, it almost made her knees buckle, washed over her. Meanwhile, back at Checkpoint Alpha 3, the atmosphere had curdled. Rob Peterson stood in a state of suspended animation, rooted to the spot where his authority had been publicly dismantled. His colleagues moved around him like he was a ghost, a cautionary tale already taking shape. Then two figures approached, their sharp suits and purposeful strides cutting through the chaos of the terminal. One was Robert Ames, the JFK Federal Security Director, a man with a stern, weathered face and the weary eyes of someone who had seen every possible failure of security and character. The other was a sharp-featured woman in a dark pantsuit, an investigator from the DHS Office of Professional Responsibility. They didn't speak to Peterson. Ames simply made a come-here gesture, with his head leading him towards a small, unmarked door. As Peterson was being led away, a woman stepped out of the now moving passenger line. She was in her late 30s, with an observant face and a stylish trench coat. She approached one of the other TSA agents, a young woman who looked thoroughly rattled. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice crisp and professional. "I was in line just now, and I witnessed that entire interaction with the young lady. I'm a journalist." She produced a business card. It read, "Beatrice Croft, Investigative Reporter, The Atlantic." I also happened to have my phone recording audio of the cue. "The agents and the young lady's voices are quite clear. I would like to offer a copy of this to the young lady if she's amenable. What happened here was unconscionable." The young TSA agent's eyes widened. A journalist. A recording. The situation was spiraling further out of control. "She was taken to the supervisor's office just back there," the agent whispered, pointing. Beatrice Croft nodded. She walked to the office and knocked softly. Chen opened the door, looking frantic. When he saw the business card Beatrice offered, his face fell even further. A media storm was the last thing he needed. "I'm not here to ambush you," Beatrice said calmly. "I'm here to help her." She looked past Chen to Amara. "My name is Beatrice Croft. I'm a reporter. I saw what he did, and I heard most of what he said. I have a recording. It's yours if you want it, no strings attached. A man like that shouldn't have a badge." Amara stood up, a new kind of strength flowing through her veins. This was no longer just a personal violation. It was a matter of public interest. A witness, an articulate professional witness with evidence, was an invaluable ally. "Thank you," Amara said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Yes, thank you." Beatrice airdropped the audio file to Amara's phone. It was a small act, but it felt momentous. It was a weapon, and it had just been placed in her hands. Just then the office door opened again. A well-dressed woman from British Airways entered, her face a mask of concern. "Ms. Vance, I'm the station manager. We've been contacted by the Undersecretary's office. Please don't worry about your flight. We have you protected. We've already moved you to first class on the next available flight, and we are being advised on how to handle your visa situation. We will take care of everything." The machine was now working for her. The cogs of bureaucracy, which had so recently ground against her, were now turning in her favor with terrifying speed and efficiency. The real drama, however, was unfolding in another even more sterile room elsewhere in the terminal. Rob Peterson sat at a metal table. Across from him sat Director Ames and the OPR investigator, Agent Thompson. A digital recorder sat between them. Officer Peterson Ames began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Let's start from the beginning. Recount your interaction with passenger Vance." This was Peterson's chance to show remorse, to plead a momentary lapse in judgment. But his arrogance and resentment were too deeply ingrained. Faced with the collapse of his world, he chose to fight, to lie. "The passenger was belligerent from the start," Peterson began, his voice gaining a whiny, self-pitying tone. "Her story seemed off, very rehearsed. The document, the visa, it didn't feel right. When I examined it, it was so flimsy it tore in my hands. It was an accident. The flimsy material just fell apart. She immediately became hysterical and started making threats." Agent Thompson, who had been silent until now, spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, but carried an edge of surgical precision. "An accident. Officer Peterson's standard-issue visa paper is printed on a high-rag content polymer-reinforced substrate. It's designed to be folded, spindled, and mutilated without tearing. You could soak it in water and it would hold together." "Are you suggesting this specific visa issued by the State Department was uniquely flimsy?" Peterson's face twitched. It seemed to be." "And you claim Ms. Vance was belligerent," Thompson continued. "That's interesting, because we have your entire interaction on a high-definition audio-enabled CCTV camera. We also have a separate clear audio recording from a passenger who was standing directly behind her. Shall we play them for you?" Peterson's bluff had been called. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, sallow pallor. He was caught. Not just caught, but exposed in a transparent, pathetic lie. Ames leaned forward, his eyes like steel chips. "Rob, you didn't just have a bad day. You didn't just make a mistake. You abused your authority. You profiled a passenger. You deliberately destroyed a federal document, which is a felony. And then you lied about it to a federal investigator. You took a bad situation and you poured gasoline on it." Peterson stared at the table. The smug gatekeeper was gone. In his place was a terrified, cornered man. "I want a lawyer," he whispered. Ames nodded slowly. "You're going to need one." He stood up. "Your employment with the Transportation Security Administration is terminated effective immediately. You are a person of interest in a federal criminal investigation. Surrender your phone and any other airport-issued property. You will be escorted from the building." The walk from the interrogation room to the employee exit was the longest of Rob Peterson's life. Stripped of his badge, his radio, his authority, he was just a man in a rumpled blue shirt. His former colleagues, the people he'd shared coffee and complaints with for years, saw him coming. As he passed, they turned their backs, busying themselves with passengers suddenly fascinated by the screens of their X-ray machines. It was a silent, brutal shunning. He was invisible. The man who held the power of entry and denial was now being unceremoniously ejected, his own access permanently, irrevocably revoked. The wheels of justice, once set in motion by Marcus Thorne's call, began to turn with a relentless, crushing momentum. For Rob Peterson, the world shrank to a series of beige rooms and probing questions. His initial interview was just the beginning. The Office of Professional Responsibility, now armed with CCTV footage, Beatrice Croft's crystal-clear audio, and Amara's composed, detailed statement built a case that was not just compelling, but airtight. The investigation laid Peterson's professional history bare. They pulled his file, and a pattern emerged. While he had never been formally disciplined for anything as egregious as destroying a document, his record was littered with minor passenger complaints, most of them alleging rude and aggressive behavior. A disproportionate number of these complaints came from non-white travelers. He was in the cold, bureaucratic language of the report, an officer who frequently escalated routine screenings into confrontational encounters, particularly with passengers of color. He wasn't a good officer who had a bad day. He was a liability who had finally spectacularly detonated. His lie about the flimsy visa was treated with particular contempt by the investigators. They brought in a materials expert from the State Department who testified that the act of tearing the visa would have required significant deliberate force. It could not have been an accident. Peterson's attempt to paint himself as the victim and Amara as the aggressor crumbled under the weight of objective evidence. The audio recording was particularly damning. It captured his sneering tone, his mocking repetition of Rhodes Scholar, and Amara's calm, increasingly desperate pleas for him to simply follow protocol. Meanwhile, Beatrice Croft was doing what she did best. She didn't rush to publish a salacious blog post. She spent 2 days working her sources. She spoke off the record to contacts within the State Department and Homeland Security. She obtained a confirmation of Amara's scholarship and a glowing character reference from a dean at Howard University. She crafted an article that was not just a story about one bad agent, but a meticulous examination of the unchecked power at security checkpoints and the insidious nature of gut-feeling policing when it's tainted by personal bias. The piece titled "The Torn Visa: How a TSA Agent's Grudge Nearly Derailed an American Dream" was published on The Atlantic's website on a Wednesday morning. It was an immediate sensation. The story was devastatingly effective because it was so precise. It named JFK Airport. It quoted Amara, with her permission granted after a long talk with her uncle and parents. It detailed the prestige of the Rhodes Scholarship, and it laid out the sequence of events in a calm, factual narrative that made Peterson's actions seem even more monstrous. The audio clip of the confrontation was embedded in the article, allowing millions of people to hear the arrogance in Peterson's voice and the quiet dignity in Amara's. The story went viral. It was picked up by every major news network. The hashtag #TSAPeterson trended on Twitter. Cable news channels convened panels of security experts, civil rights lawyers, and former TSA officials to dissect the incident. The public outcry was swift and furious. People shared their own travel horror stories. The incident touched a raw nerve in the public consciousness, the feeling of helplessness when facing an agent with absolute power and a bad attitude. The TSA, as an organization, was thrown into full-blown crisis mode. Their press office, accustomed to dealing with complaints about long lines and intrusive pat-downs, was besieged. The initial bland statement about taking the matter seriously and an ongoing investigation was met with public ridicule. Under immense pressure, the head of the TSA was forced to schedule a press conference. Standing before a phalanx of cameras, looking grim and deeply uncomfortable, he publicly apologized to Amara Vance by name. The actions of former Officer Peterson are an embarrassment to this agency and a betrayal of the trust the American people place in us, the administrator said, reading from a prepared statement. They do not represent the values, training, or professionalism of the tens of thousands of dedicated officers who do their jobs with integrity every day. We have offered our unreserved apology to Ms. Vance and her family, and we are taking steps to ensure that something like this never, ever happens again. For David Chen, the supervisor, the fallout was just as severe, if quieter. He was fired not for malice, but for cowardice and incompetence. His attempt to cover for Peterson and mislead a superior officer was deemed an unforgivable failure of leadership. His career in federal service was over. He became a case study in training seminars, a cautionary tale for managers on what happens when you prioritize avoiding a scene over doing your job. But for Rob Peterson, the consequences were far more personal and catastrophic. The media storm had made his name and face recognizable. He couldn't leave his small Long Island house without neighbors staring. The local news had parked a van down his street. His wife, a quiet woman who had endured his simmering bitterness for years, finally reached her breaking point. The public shame, the vitriol online, and the stark reality of their new financial situation were the final straws. One evening, after a stony, silent dinner, she told him she was leaving and taking their son with her. "I can't do this anymore, Rob," she'd said, her voice devoid of emotion. "That anger of yours, you finally let it burn down the whole house, our whole life." He was now truly alone, trapped in the house his federal salary had paid for, with nothing but the television replaying the story of his own self-destruction. The hard karma he had inflicted upon Amara, questioning her legitimacy, attempting to tear up her future, was now visiting him tenfold. His own identity as a federal officer, a provider, a husband had been stripped away and torn to pieces. He was a pariah, not just at the airport, but in his own life. The world he had once judged from behind his podium was now judging him, and the verdict was unanimous. While Rob Peterson's life was imploding, Amara Vance's was being meticulously reconstructed by a bureaucracy now desperate to make amends. The morning after the incident, she was escorted not through the chaotic main terminal, but through a quiet, private security screening area reserved for diplomats and VIPs. Her uncle Marcus Thorne had arrived, as promised his presence a comforting shield against the lingering trauma of the previous day. He held a new passport for her. Inside, affixed with an official seal from the State Department's Emergency Consular Services, was a brand new F1 visa. It had been processed, printed, and delivered overnight, an act of bureaucratic speed that was nothing short of miraculous. "They owed you that and more," Marcus said, his voice grim as he handed it to her in a private lounge British Airways had provided. "Amara, I am so sorry you had to go through this. It wasn't your fault, Uncle Marcus," she said, her fingers tracing the smooth, untorn edges of the new visa. "He didn't know who I was. He didn't know who you were. He just saw me, and he decided I wasn't worthy." The insight was so sharp, so clear, it made Marcus's heart ache. She understood the core of it perfectly. It wasn't about a document. It was about prejudice given power. The airline had bumped her to their most luxurious first-class cabin. The flight crew treated her with a deference that was almost reverential. As the plane ascended, banking over the Atlantic, Amara looked out the window, watching the land recede. She felt a profound sense of detachment from the ugly scene at the airport. It felt like a fever dream, a story that had happened to someone else. But the shadow of it remained a cold spot in her memory. The consequences for Peterson, however, were just getting started. Termination from the TSA was only the first domino. A week after the incident, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York unsealed a 2-count indictment. Robert Peterson was charged with 1 count of willful destruction of a federal travel document and 1 count of deprivation of rights under color of law. The second charge was the most serious. It was a federal civil rights violation. The Department of Justice was formally accusing him of using his position as a government agent to unlawfully deprive Amara Vance of her constitutional rights based on his own personal biases. It elevated his crime from simple vandalism to an attack on the very principles of equal protection. The news of the indictment was another media sensation, serving as the capstone on the public narrative. This wasn't just a firing, it was a criminal prosecution. The system wasn't just cleaning house, it was seeking justice. Peterson, out on bail and represented by a beleaguered public defender, was a broken man. His bravado was gone, replaced by a sullen, terrified silence. His lie to the investigators meant that no prosecutor would ever offer him a favorable plea deal. He had torched his own credibility. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that a trial would be a formality, a public spectacle of his guilt. His financial situation was dire. His federal pension, which he had been just a few years from collecting, was now subject to forfeiture due to the felony conviction that was all but certain. The legal fees were mounting. His wife had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and was seeking full custody of their son. The house had a "for sale" sign on the lawn. One afternoon, months later, as his case was slowly moving through the federal court system, Peterson was working a new job. He was a night shift stalker at a cavernous 24-hour big-box store in a neighboring town. The work was anonymous, back-breaking, and paid a fraction of his old salary. He wore a simple red vest, his name Rob printed on a cheap plastic tag. During his break, he sat in the sterile employee break room, scrolling through the news on his cheap smartphone. He saw a headline from an international news source, American Rhodes Scholar Amara Vance delivers acclaimed address at Oxford Union on the new colonialism of bureaucracy. The article featured a photo of Amara. She stood at a grand, historic lectern, looking out at a packed hall. She looked poised, brilliant, and powerful. She wasn't just a student, she was a voice. The article quoted her speech, "Power is not always wielded with a gun or a sword," she had said. Sometimes it is wielded with a rubber stamp, a bureaucratic form, or the arbitrary interpretation of a rule. When prejudice is allowed to hide behind a badge or a title, it commits a unique kind of violence. It seeks not just to control the body, but to invalidate the soul, to tear up the very story of who you are and where you belong. Rob Peterson stared at her face on the screen. He saw no hint of the frightened girl he had tried to humiliate at the airport. He saw a woman who had taken the ugliest moment of her life and forged it into a source of strength, a platform for her intellect. He had tried to break her, but he had only made her stronger. He, on the other hand, was utterly broken. The smug satisfaction he had felt in that moment of tearing her visa had been a fleeting, poisonous drug. The high had lasted for less than a minute. The consequences would last for the rest of his life. He had lost his career, his pension, his family, and his self-respect. He had traded everything for a single pathetic exercise of power over a young woman whose future he could not even comprehend. He turned off the phone, the screen going dark. He looked at his own reflection in the blank screen. A tired, defeated man in a red vest. The karma wasn't just hard, it was poetic. He had tried to deny her entry into a new chapter of her life, and in doing so, he had been violently ejected from his own left, with nothing but the weight of his actions and the bitter taste of a self-inflicted ruin. The ancient city of Oxford was a balm for Amara's soul. The honey-colored stone of the colleges, worn smooth by centuries of rain and ambition, seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent memory of JFK. She walked beneath the dreaming spires, lost herself in the labyrinthine stacks of the Bodleian Library, and engaged in fierce, exhilarating debates with tutors and peers who were among the sharpest minds of her generation. She thrived. Her speech at the Oxford Union was just the beginning. The experience at the airport had given her academic work a new, raw urgency. Her research on post-colonial literature now had a deeply personal contemporary anchor. She wrote with a fire and clarity that distinguished her even among her brilliant cohort. She was no longer just studying theory, she was analyzing a system she had personally collided with. Yet the victory was not without its scars. She found herself tensing up in queues, her heart rate accelerating when she saw uniformed security personnel. A part of her remained on high alert, a lingering shadow of the helplessness she had felt as Peterson held her future in his hands. She was a symbol of resilience, but she was also a young woman who had been a victim of a vicious, targeted attack. Her uncle Marcus called her weakly, his check-ins a quiet acknowledgement of the trauma that lay beneath the success story. She chose not to follow the day-to-day proceedings of Robert Peterson's court case. Her parents and uncle kept her informed of the major developments, but she refused to let his fate occupy her present. She had a new life to build. The verdict, when it came, was inevitable. A jury took less than 2 hours to find him guilty on both counts. The CCTV footage, the audio recording, and the testimony of Agent Thompson had been irrefutable. At his sentencing, Peterson, looking gaunt and aged, finally offered a halting, mumbled apology to a court that had already passed judgment. The judge was unmoved. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice ringing with judicial authority, "you were entrusted with the security of this nation and the protection of its people and its visitors. You twisted that trust into a weapon of personal prejudice. You did not just tear a piece of paper. You attacked the fundamental promise of equal treatment under the law. Your actions were a disgrace to your uniform." Robert Peterson was sentenced to 18 months in a low-security federal prison. He was ordered to pay restitution for the costs of replacing Amara's documents and her flight. He lost his pension permanently. The sentence was a clear message sent to every federal agent in the country. There would be zero tolerance for such abuse. On the day of his sentencing, Amara was walking through Christ Church Meadow, the River Cherwell, flowing gently nearby. Her phone buzzed with a text from her uncle. "It's over. Justice was served." Amara read the text and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She felt no elation, no sense of vengeance. She only felt a quiet, somber sense of closure. His punishment did not erase what he had done, but it affirmed that what he had done was wrong. The system, for all its flaws, had ultimately held one of its own accountable. Her experience had changed the trajectory of her life in ways she never could have anticipated. She began collaborating with civil liberties organizations, lending her voice and her story to advocate for better training, stronger oversight, and more robust accountability mechanisms for security agencies. She became an advocate for the very principles Peterson had tried to deny her. Years later, a newly minted Dr. Amara Vance, she returned to the United States to accept a professorship at a prestigious university. She was a respected academic, a published author, and a powerful voice on issues of civil rights and institutional power. On her first trip back through JFK, she approached the security checkpoint with a flicker of old anxiety. But this time was different. The agent who looked at her passport was a young professional woman who smiled warmly. "Welcome home, Dr. Vance," the agent said, handing back her passport. Amara smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. She walked through the gate not as a victim, but as a victor. The shadow was still there, a faint tracing in her memory, but it no longer held any power over her. Robert Peterson, a name she rarely thought of, was a footnote in her story, a bitter man who had tried to build a wall in her path and had instead become the rubble under her feet. Her journey had been unexpectedly diverted through a valley of darkness, but she had emerged on the other side not just unscathed, but illuminated her future, brighter and more impactful than she had ever dared to dream. That is the story of Amara Vance, and the agent who learned that power is fleeting, but character and consequences are forever. What happened at that JFK checkpoint was more than an argument. It was a defining moment that revealed the best and worst of human nature. It shows that even in the face of systemic power, a single voice, a single call for justice can trigger an avalanche of change. If this story of resilience and hard karma resonated with you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. These are the kinds of real-life dramas that remind us to stand up against injustice wherever we find it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next deep dive into stories that matter. Thank you for listening.